At 0237 on the 17th of November 2025, a fully loaded Q-Flex LNG carrier went from a routine radar return to a problem statement. It lay at anchor in a Russian offshore energy zone, 10-15 kilometers off the coast, holding roughly 90,000 tons of LNG in tanks, totaling about 170,000 M3. On coastal displays, the change was instant. A clean hull outline suddenly wrapped in white-hot pixels as a column of flame punched 8,120 meters into the air, and a thermal bloom spread out several hundred meters around the ship. The sequence did not begin with a pump failure or a valve left open. It began when a long-range Ukrainian UAV assessed as a UJ-26 Bober arrived at wavetop height and drove into the port-side tank block with a 300 kilograms HE frag payload. The detonation ripped through 20-30 millimeters of outer steel and insulation, tore open several square meters of surface, and vented supercooled LNG straight into open air. The liquid flashed to vapor, expanded on a roughly 1:600 ratio, and rolled downwind as a dense, low cloud that hit the flammable band, found an ignition source, and turned into the overpressure spike the sensors recorded. At the moment of impact, the carrier sat under what Russian planners considered a closed umbrella coastal surface wave radar, likely Podsolnuk E, feeding a layered defense, with escort vessels mounting Pantsir S-1 and AK-630 inside the exclusion ring. On paper, that stack should have stopped a slow, low target flying at 20-50 meters over the sea. In practice, the inbound UJ-26 crossed the envelope without a single committed track, and minutes later, those same units still could not hold a stable lock on a second confirmed UAV entering the same box. In the months before the 17th of November 2025, the Russian LNG terminal that would be hit functioned as a high-value but routine node in the export network. Loaded carriers followed a fixed pattern approach under escort, anchored 10-15 kilometers offshore inside a marked exclusion zone, complete transfer operations, then depart along defined lanes tracked by civilian AIS and monitored by insurers and regulators. The area was treated as secure. Coastal surveillance radars, likely including Podsolnuk E or an equivalent surface wave system, covered the approaches. Behind them sat layered air defense built around Buk M2 or S-300 PM2 batteries, short-range systems such as Pantsir S-1 and naval AK-630 mounts guarded harbor entrances and the Anchorage itself. For Ukrainian planners, that layout high economic value, fixed operating rhythm, and defenses tuned to larger, faster, higher signature threats described a stable target. By the time clocks in Kyiv were nearing 20:00 on the 16th of November 2025, analysts in the capital and in forward operating cells had already assembled a focused picture of the terminal. Satellite imagery series documented construction stages and pipeline routes. Synthetic aperture radar frames mapped pier and mooring geometry. Commercial AIS logs showed typical arrival and departure windows for Q-Flex class carriers. Nighttime thermal imagery identified which structures stayed hot through the dark hours. By 23:30 that night, traffic monitoring had already confirmed that one Q-Flex class LNG carrier later recorded as the vessel struck at 0237 had taken position in the Anchorage, swung to its assigned heading, and stabilized inside the exclusion ring. With the target fixed, attention shifted to the delivery system. The chosen platform was a long-range, one-way UAV assessed as a UJ-26 Bober variant, configured for low-altitude maritime penetration. Mission parameters loaded into a ground station in eastern Ukraine defined a route of several hundred kilometers, a cruise speed in the 150-200 kilometers per H-band, and a terminal altitude of 20-50 meters above mean sea level. The airframe's estimated radar cross-section RCS in the 0.010. 1 square meter range kept it below the comfortable detection band of systems tuned for conventional aircraft, anti-ship missiles, or fast surface craft. Navigation rested on a hybrid INS plus GPS solution using preloaded waypoints at sea and reference points along the coastline. Guidance software continuously compared predicted and actual positions, applying corrections over distinct shoreline features and light patterns. Mission design aimed to keep the UAV below the effective radar horizon of coastal surveillance for as long as possible. A radar antenna at 20-30 meters above sea level sees very low targets at roughly 20-25 kilometers. If the UJ-26 Bober held 20-50 meters of altitude over the water, it would only present a clear, stable return to coastal radar in the final minutes of its run. Crews at a prepared site east of the Frontline sent the UJ-26 Bober off the rail at about 0105 on the 17th of November 2025. The UJ-26 Bober climbed to transit altitude, accelerated to cruise speed, then stepped down toward sea level as it approached the maritime leg. In a hardened Ukrainian control node, the aircraft appeared on a digital mission console as a single track tagged with speed, heading, and estimated times of arrival at each waypoint. A separate overlay displayed the projected position of the Q-Flex class carrier, updated via external feeds. On Ukrainian screens, the geometry reduced to one moving symbol running into one anchored symbol before first light. On the Russian side, the picture remained broad. Coastal radar operators saw a standard night pattern bright, steady returns from anchored tankers and terminal structures, intermittent tracks from surface vessels, and a base layer of sea clutter from moderate wave action. Echoes from low, slow. Small RCS objects close to the surface sat near the threshold where automatic clutter suppression algorithms operate. In the narrow window between 0130 and 0145, one or more minor contacts may have flickered in the 40-60 kilometer band, but they would have registered as unstable pips, fading in and out against the background. Under those conditions, procedures and habit both pointed toward classifying such returns as artifacts rather than threats. As the UJ-26 Bober closed the last stretch of open water, the ranges began to compress. By roughly 0220, the UAV had already slipped inside about 25 kilometers of the Anchorage. At its nominal speed about 180 kilometers per H, near 50 meters per second time to target, dropped into single-digit minutes. Medium-range systems such as Buke M2 or S300 PM2 still saw no familiar profile. If the contact appeared at all in their picture, it did not behave like a maneuvering fighter, a ballistic trajectory, or a conventional high-speed cruise missile. With no firm cue from coastal radar and no clear match to known threat templates, there was little pressure to dedicate scarce engagement channels to a low-confidence track. 10 minutes later, around 0230, that compression finally became obvious on Russian scopes. The UJ-26 Bober crossed the 10-kilometer line from the LNG carrier. Roughly 200 seconds remained to impact. On the Ukrainian console, a single symbol advanced along a shallow line toward the anchored ship. The track was stable, speed and heading inside planned parameters. In the Russian picture, any return associated with the UAV sat near the clutter band, still competing with low-level noise and slow-moving contacts. Closing further, the UAV entered the 8-10 kilometer zone where coastal radar and fire control channels could finally hold it as a stable target. That shift cut usable reaction time to roughly 160, 180 seconds. Systems like Pantsir S-1 on shore and AK-630 aboard nearby vessels now had a short window to move from detection to a firing decision, extract a small, low-flying object from clutter, classify it as hostile, commit a channel, and authorize a shot. The UJ-26 Bober had already crossed inside roughly 5 kilometers of the carrier by about 0234. On range charts, this sat well inside the reach of AK-630 and still within the inner ring of Pantsir S-1. In the actual firing picture, within range was not enough. Any stream of 30 mm rounds from an AK-630 mount, or a Pantsir S-1 missile trajectory that overshot or broke up in flight, could cross the hull of the LNG carrier or critical pier installations. Safety logic and human supervisors in the loop are designed to block shots with unacceptable collateral paths, especially under peacetime-adjacent rules of engagement. Under that constraint, potential engagements died in the safety chain. The UAV continued to close inside the Ukrainian control cell. Those constraints were not visible. The mission console switched to a simple countdown to the programmed impact point range decreasing, estimated time shrinking with each refresh 120 seconds. 90 seconds. 60 seconds. Link status remained clean. No jamming indicators appeared. The carrier held its heading and speed. No new tracks consistent with interceptor launches intersected the UAV's projected course. On screen, a single symbol continued on a straight line toward the anchored ship. 92 minutes after launch, at 0237 on the 17th of November 2025, the single inbound track finally merged with the anchored ship. The UJ-26 Bober struck the portside tank block at an oblique angle. Its 200 and 300 kilograms HE-frag warhead detonating fractionally before full structural penetration. The blast punched through 20-30 millimeters of outer hull, plating and insulation, opening several square meters of surface. The immediate explosion generated localized fragmentation and overpressure in the void space, enough to tear through internal structures, but not to destroy the ship by itself. The liquid cargo determined the scale of what followed. Liquefied natural gas inside the damaged tank, stored near 160 degrees at near atmospheric pressure, vented through the breach and flashed rapidly from liquid to gas. Within seconds, a dense, cold vapor cloud formed along the lee side of the hull, hugging the sea surface and spreading with the wind. As it mixed with ambient air, parts of the cloud passed through a flammable band. An ignition source within the plume exposed electrical equipment. Sparking metal contact or hot machinery triggered a secondary detonation. That event produced the main fireball and pressure wave. Thermal signatures recorded by remote sensors indicate that the fire column rose to roughly 8,120 meters above the waterline, with a thermal hazard radius of about 200-300 meters, in which unprotected materials experienced severe heating. Overpressure sufficient to shatter windows and damage light structures propagated outward, striking nearby service vessels and sections of the shore facility. Fragmentation from the initial HE-frag detonation added a further threat band, but most of the large-scale damage came from heat and blast associated with the vapor cloud ignition. For Russian defenders, the ignition converted the engagement problem into a sensor problem. The sudden appearance of a large infrared source at the center of the anchorage reshaped the visual and thermal picture. For Panzer S1 or similar systems using electro-optical and infrared channels alongside radar, the burning carrier became a dominant hotspot in the field of view. Smaller objects, such as a second UJ-26 Bober, moving at low altitude in the same sector, risked being masked by glare and blooming across sensor arrays. Radar performance degraded in parallel. Superheated gas, smoke, and debris generated multiple transient returns. Larger sections of structural steel, cargo handling equipment, or containers broken loose by the blast produced their own echoes as they fell or drifted. On radar scopes, the anchorage resolved into a cluster of moving and semi-stationary contacts at low speed and low altitude, the same envelope in which a second UAV would appear. Automatic tracking algorithms, tuned to apply behavior-based logic, struggled to separate a small inbound track from non-threatening debris. The Ukrainian plan had been built around that state. A second UJ-26 Bober had launched on a staggered timeline, routed to arrive after the ignition. While the first UAV approached on a direct maritime axis, the second followed a dog-legged course that brought it in from a different azimuth, passing through the shadow of the burning carrier relative to key coastal radars. Its timing was set to bring it to the 15-kilometer ring shortly after the fireball formed, and the sensor picture collapsed around the anchorage. Within 2 minutes of the first fireball, by about 0239, the second UJ-26 Bober had closed to within roughly 15 kilometers of the terminal. On Ukrainian displays, it appeared as another inbound track with a clean telemetry stream and steadily decreasing range. On Russian sensors, it was one more low RCS, low-speed contact inside a sector already crowded with returns from smoke, debris, and infrastructure. As the second UAV crossed inside 10 kilometers, then 5 kilometers, the theoretical engagement picture remained favorable. Systems like Panzer S1 and AK-630 are designed to defeat small, slow inbound targets at those ranges. The real picture combined saturated infrared channels, cluttered radar scopes, uncertain identification, and restrictive firing solutions around hazardous cargo. Any shot into the Anchorage carried the risk that a miss or even a successful intercept would scatter fragments and burning debris across the damaged carrier and nearby structures. For commanders and gunners, the decision tree narrowed toward restraint. Telemetry later recovered on the Ukrainian side showed no interruptions in the second aircraft's guidance or propulsion up to its terminal maneuver. The log contained no abrupt heading or altitude changes indicative of missile evasion or close-range gunfire. In its data stream, the transit of the defended zone appeared as a steady reduction in range to target without external interference. The second UJ-26 Bober entered the terminal perimeter and struck a shoreside processing unit, feeding the main pipeline grid. The detonation was smaller than the LNG ignition, but sufficient to rupture exposed pipework and auxiliary structures, broaden the damage footprint, and compromise additional parts of the facility. Fire and blast from this hit added new hotspots and debris to an already overloaded sensor picture. By the time the fire from the initial LNG event shifted from active growth to a managed burn, the kinetic phase of the UAV operation had ended. The defense network remained in place on maps and rosters radars. Launchers, guns, trained crews, but in the minutes between 0230 and 0245, the combination of geometry, physics, sensor limits, and human risk thresholds had turned a heavily armed zone into a corridor that two UJ-26 Bober airframes crossed without a single documented, sustained fire control lock. By the time the LNG carrier's fire was contained, the strike itself was over. What remained was arithmetic. One Q-Flex class tanker carrying roughly 90,000 tons of LNG was effectively removed from service months at minimum. Pier sections, pipelines, and auxiliary systems showed heat deformation outside their design envelope. Even under conservative assumptions, the direct losses in hull, cargo, repairs, and idle time pushed into the high hundreds of millions of dollars. Additional shutdown requirements, inspection of adjacent berths, purging of contaminated lines, and recalibration of fire suppression systems extended the operational pause across the entire terminal complex. The more significant damage sat inside the defense model. Safety envelopes around Russian LNG operations assumed threat types, exclusion distances, engagement geometry no longer matched the real event. A pair of UJ-26 Bober UAVs flying at 20-50 meters crossed a defensive stack built on Partsolno E. Buk M2 S-300 PM-2 Pantsir S-1 and AK-630 without a single sustained fire control lock. The architecture held its shape on paper. It failed against a low RCS. Sea-skimming profile for planners. The implication was immediate. Every LNG anchorage inside UAV flight radius required wider standoff distance, more escorts, and continuous sensor fusion, none of which existed in the posture before the strike. The outcome is simple. Once an LNG terminal enters a high-energy incident state, legacy air defense logic cannot filter, classify, or fire quickly enough. A UAV carrying a 200 ITAU, 300 kilograms 80 frag warhead becomes a strategic instrument rather than a disposable munition. After 0237 on the 17th of November 2025, no Russian LNG route inside UAV flight radius can be described as secure again. Every subsequent transit now sits inside a geometry already proven vulnerable.